The plane soared smoothly through the clear skies, and the hum of the engines was the only sound inside the cabin. But suddenly, everything changed. A hush fell over the passengers as they watched in disbelief. A flight attendant, who had been serving drinks moments earlier, was now standing face to face with a woman in her seat. The woman, calm but visibly upset, stared up at the flight attendant, trying to understand what was happening. It all started when the flight attendant, a woman in her mid-30s, approached the black woman sitting near the window. She had smiled at first, as she did with every other passenger. But her smile quickly faded when she spoke to the woman in a tone that seemed off, condescending, almost dismissive. "Excuse me, I need to ask you to move," the flight attendant said, her voice sharper than necessary. The black woman, who had been traveling alone, raised an eyebrow, unsure of why she was being asked to move. "I'm sorry, what?" she replied, her voice steady despite the sudden tension that hung in the air. The flight attendant repeated the request, this time with a more impatient edge. "I said you need to move. There's someone else who needs this seat." The woman didn't move. She wasn't sure what to say or what to do, but something didn't sit right. The way the flight attendant was speaking to her felt different from how she had spoken to the other passengers. There was something about her tone, something that made the woman feel uncomfortable and singled out. She looked around the cabin, hoping to make sense of the situation. The other passengers were watching, some with confused glances, others whispering to each other. But no one stepped in. No one spoke up. The woman took a deep breath, deciding to stand her ground. "I paid for this seat. I don't understand why you're asking me to move." The flight attendant's face hardened. "You'll need to move, or I'll have to get the captain involved," she said, her eyes narrowing. Now, the entire cabin was on edge. The passengers who had been observing the interaction began murmuring among themselves, their curiosity growing. Was this a simple misunderstanding, or was something more sinister going on? The woman remained calm. She was no stranger to being treated differently because of the color of her skin. But she had never experienced anything like this before, especially in the middle of a flight. "I'm not moving until you explain why," she said firmly. The tension in the cabin escalated. The flight attendant stood there, unmoving, while the woman in the seat refused to back down. The flight attendant's eyes darted around, trying to gauge whether anyone would back her up. But no one did. There was an awkward silence as the tension reached its peak. Suddenly, the flight attendant's supervisor appeared in the aisle. The flight attendant seemed to shrink under his gaze, her posture shifting. "Is there a problem here?" the supervisor asked, his voice stern but calm. The woman, still seated, shook her head. "I'm not sure," she said, her voice steady. "But I'm being asked to move without any explanation." The supervisor nodded, his gaze shifting from the flight attendant to the woman. "Let's get this sorted out," he said, his tone more conciliatory now. As the supervisor and the flight attendant spoke in hushed tones, the woman began to feel a strange unease. There was something deeply unsettling about the way things were unfolding. She couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this incident than just a misunderstanding. The passengers continued to watch, their eyes filled with uncertainty. What was going on? Was this a simple case of a flight attendant making a mistake, or was something more insidious at play? The woman sat in silence, waiting for an explanation. But the truth was, she wasn't sure she would get the answers she was hoping for. Something told her that this was only the beginning, and what happened next would leave everyone in the cabin, herself included, speechless. As the plane cruised on, the tension remained thick in the air. The passengers went back to their routines, some attempting to ignore the drama, while others watched the situation unfold with a mix of confusion and discomfort. The woman, still seated, took a deep breath and glanced out the window. The sky was a calm blue, a stark contrast to the storm brewing in the cabin. But despite the calm surroundings, her mind raced. For years, she had endured the quiet, hidden biases of the world around her. A glance here, a comment there. In some places, people tried to mask their discomfort with her presence. She had learned to adapt, to walk with her head high even when the world tried to pull her down. But what had just happened in that cabin wasn't just another glance or comment. It felt different. It felt like a direct challenge. The flight attendant's behavior was too blatant to ignore, and something told her that the situation would not resolve easily. Her heart pounded as she thought about everything she had gone through to get here. She wasn't just any passenger. She had worked hard to get to this point in her life. She had fought to build a career, to support her family, to make a life for herself. Yet, time and time again, the world had tried to remind her that the color of her skin made her different, made her lesser. But she wasn't lesser. She had earned everything she had, and she wasn't going to let anyone take that away from her. Not now. Not after everything she had been through. The woman shifted in her seat, preparing herself for what might come next. But as she did, something strange happened. A feeling of calm washed over her, a strange sense of clarity. For the first time in a long while, she realized that she wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for something bigger, something more important. This wasn't just about one flight, one passenger, or even one flight attendant. This was about a larger issue, an ongoing fight that had never truly been addressed. And in this moment, she had the opportunity to make a difference. She couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The flight attendant's actions weren't just a mistake, they were deliberate. But why? What had caused her to react this way? Was it something personal, or was it rooted in something deeper, something she hadn't been able to see yet? As the supervisor returned to his seat, the woman glanced at the flight attendant. Their eyes briefly met, but the flight attendant quickly looked away, her face flushed. The woman's mind raced, piecing together the puzzle. She had noticed the way the flight attendant had acted earlier, the way she had seemed almost eager to challenge her. It was as though she had been waiting for this moment to confront her. But why? Just as she was about to gather her thoughts, a voice broke through the quiet hum of the plane. "We're sorry for the inconvenience, folks. We're just working out a small issue with seating. It'll be resolved shortly," the captain's voice echoed through the intercom. The woman nodded to herself. A small issue with seating? No, this wasn't a small issue. This was something far more complex. The passengers were still murmuring, but the air was thick with uncertainty. The woman felt a deep unease settling in her chest. She couldn't ignore it any longer. There was something more to this. Something far more troubling. As the plane continued its journey, she turned her attention to the other passengers. Their eyes shifted quickly when they noticed her looking at them. Some seemed genuinely concerned, but most of them were just watching for the next development. A few passengers had noticed the flight attendant's odd behavior, but none had stepped in to speak up. It was as if they were afraid to get involved, not wanting to make waves. But the woman wasn't afraid anymore. What had started as a simple confrontation was now something bigger, a realization that this wasn't just her fight, it was a fight for everyone who had ever been made to feel small. As the woman settled back in her seat, she steeled herself for whatever would come next. She wasn't backing down, and she wouldn't let this moment pass without taking a stand. There was more to this situation than anyone could see. And the truth was just waiting to come to the surface. The woman shifted in her seat, preparing herself for what might come next. But as she did, something strange happened. A feeling of calm washed over her, a strange sense of clarity. For the first time in a long while, she realized that she wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for something bigger, something more important. This wasn't just about one flight, one passenger, or even one flight attendant. This was about a larger issue, an ongoing fight that had never truly been addressed. And in this moment, she had the opportunity to make a difference. She couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The flight attendant's actions weren't just a mistake, they were deliberate. But why? What had caused her to react this way? Was it something personal, or was it rooted in something deeper, something she hadn't been able to see yet? As the supervisor returned to his seat, the woman glanced at the flight attendant. Their eyes briefly met, but the flight attendant quickly looked away, her face flushed. The woman's mind raced, piecing together the puzzle. She had noticed the way the flight attendant had acted earlier, the way she had seemed almost eager to challenge her. It was as though she had been waiting for this moment to confront her. But why? Just as she was about to gather her thoughts, a voice broke through the quiet hum of the plane. "We're sorry for the inconvenience, folks. We're just working out a small issue with seating. It'll be resolved shortly," the captain's voice echoed through the intercom. The woman nodded to herself. A small issue with seating? No, this wasn't a small issue. This was something far more complex. The passengers were still murmuring, but the air was thick with uncertainty. The woman felt a deep unease settling in her chest. She couldn't ignore it any longer. There was something more to this. Something far more troubling. As the plane continued its journey, she turned her attention to the other passengers. Their eyes shifted quickly when they noticed her looking at them. Some seemed genuinely concerned, but most of them were just watching for the next development. A few passengers had noticed the flight attendant's odd behavior, but none had stepped in to speak up. It was as if they were afraid to get involved, not wanting to make waves. But the woman wasn't afraid anymore. What had started as a simple confrontation was now something bigger, a realization that this wasn't just her fight, it was a fight for everyone who had ever been made to feel small. As the woman settled back in her seat, she steeled herself for whatever would come next. She wasn't backing down, and she wouldn't let this moment pass without taking a stand. There was more to this situation than anyone could see. And the truth was just waiting to come to the surface. The woman shifted in her seat, preparing herself for what might come next. But as she did, something strange happened. A feeling of calm washed over her, a strange sense of clarity. For the first time in a long while, she realized that she wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for something bigger, something more important. This wasn't just about one flight, one passenger, or even one flight attendant. This was about a larger issue, an ongoing fight that had never truly been addressed. And in this moment, she had the opportunity to make a difference. She couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The flight attendant's actions weren't just a mistake, they were deliberate. But why? What had caused her to react this way? Was it something personal, or was it rooted in something deeper, something she hadn't been able to see yet? As the supervisor returned to his seat, the woman glanced at the flight attendant. Their eyes briefly met, but the flight attendant quickly looked away, her face flushed. The woman's mind raced, piecing together the puzzle. She had noticed the way the flight attendant had acted earlier, the way she had seemed almost eager to challenge her. It was as though she had been waiting for this moment to confront her. But why? Just as she was about to gather her thoughts, a voice broke through the quiet hum of the plane. "We're sorry for the inconvenience, folks. We're just working out a small issue with seating. It'll be resolved shortly," the captain's voice echoed through the intercom. The woman nodded to herself. A small issue with seating? No, this wasn't a small issue. This was something far more complex. The passengers were still murmuring, but the air was thick with uncertainty. The woman felt a deep unease settling in her chest. She couldn't ignore it any longer. There was something more to this. Something far more troubling. As the plane continued its journey, she turned her attention to the other passengers. Their eyes shifted quickly when they noticed her looking at them. Some seemed genuinely concerned, but most of them were just watching for the next development. A few passengers had noticed the flight attendant's odd behavior, but none had stepped in to speak up. It was as if they were afraid to get involved, not wanting to make waves. But the woman wasn't afraid anymore. What had started as a simple confrontation was now something bigger, a realization that this wasn't just her fight, it was a fight for everyone who had ever been made to feel small. As the woman settled back in her seat, she steeled herself for whatever would come next. She wasn't backing down, and she wouldn't let this moment pass without taking a stand. There was more to this situation than anyone could see. And the truth was just waiting to come to the surface. The plane continued its journey, but the mood in the cabin had shifted. The tension from the earlier confrontation lingered in the air, and the passengers seemed to sense that something wasn't quite right. The woman, still seated by the window, looked out at the endless expanse of blue. But her mind was not on the view, it was focused on the storm that was brewing inside the plane. Her thoughts raced as she tried to piece together the events that had unfolded. She had felt the flight attendant's glare earlier, and now, the woman couldn't shake the feeling that something more was at play here. The woman's past experiences with discrimination, though painful, had taught her to be cautious. Nothing ever happened by accident. But this? This felt different. It wasn't just a small act of rudeness. The flight attendant had deliberately challenged her, and that meant something was wrong. The other passengers continued to glance at the woman with concern, but most of them quickly turned their attention away. No one spoke up, as though they were all too afraid to get involved. The silence weighed heavily on her, and for a brief moment, she wondered if they saw her as just another inconvenience, another woman of color on a flight who wasn't supposed to challenge authority. The woman sighed, trying to calm herself. She wasn't going to let their silence control her. She had to stand her ground. It was then that the flight attendant returned, her expression somewhat calmer but still tense. She walked past the woman, her eyes avoiding contact. But as she passed, the woman could feel a shift, a strange, almost imperceptible change in the atmosphere. It was as if the entire plane held its breath, waiting for something to happen. Then, as if to push the boundaries even further, the flight attendant made a beeline for the woman's seat. She stopped right in front of her, folding her arms and leaning slightly forward. "I need to speak to you," the flight attendant said, her voice low but firm. The woman looked up, her eyes meeting the flight attendant's, but there was no hint of fear in her gaze. She had faced this kind of treatment before, but this time, she was ready to face it head-on. "What is this about?" the woman asked, her voice calm yet laced with determination. The flight attendant took a moment before speaking again. "I think you know why I asked you to move," she said, her voice more forceful now, but there was something strange in her eyes, something that didn't seem to align with the words she was speaking. The woman felt a sudden, uneasy sensation. It was as if the flight attendant wasn't speaking from a place of authority, but from somewhere deeper, somewhere personal. "You don't have the right to treat me like this," the woman replied, her voice unwavering. "I paid for my seat just like everyone else, and I won't let anyone tell me otherwise." The flight attendant's face flushed with anger, but before she could respond, the supervisor, who had been sitting nearby, stood up and moved toward them. His presence, calm yet firm, had a strange effect on the entire cabin. The passengers' eyes shifted once again, but this time, there was an underlying tension. The woman couldn't shake the feeling that this was more than just a petty disagreement. "I'm going to have to ask both of you to step into the galley," the supervisor said, his voice sharp and commanding. The woman stood up without hesitation. She wasn't afraid of what might come next. She had lived too many years being treated like this to be intimidated by a flight attendant, no matter how much authority she wielded. She could feel the eyes of the passengers on her, their whispers barely audible in the background. As they stepped into the galley, the supervisor's face remained neutral, but the flight attendant's anger was palpable. The woman could feel the tension in the small space between them, but she didn't flinch. She was no stranger to discomfort. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but I have to ask you to leave the plane immediately," the supervisor said, surprising both women with the sharpness of his words. What? The woman said, shocked but not entirely surprised. You're asking me to leave? The supervisor nodded. I'm afraid you'll have to leave. We've had complaints, and there are policies in place that. Before he could finish, the woman's eyes narrowed. Complaints? Who complained? She asked, her voice cutting through the tense atmosphere like a knife. The supervisor hesitated, glancing at the flight attendant before answering. We can't disclose that information, but I'm afraid this matter is beyond my control. The woman took a step back, her mind racing. Who could have complained? What had happened between her and the flight attendant that would lead to such an escalation? The woman didn't know what to believe anymore. The more she thought about it, the more the situation seemed like an act of retaliation, something more than just a misunderstanding. Just then, something unexpected happened. A voice from the back of the plane interrupted the conversation. Excuse me, is everything all right here? A passenger stood up and made their way toward the galley. The woman turned to see who had spoken, and when she saw the person, she was stunned. It was a familiar face, someone she hadn't expected to see on this flight. Her heart skipped a beat. This passenger was no ordinary person. The man who stepped forward was someone the woman had not expected to see, especially on a commercial flight. He wasn't a celebrity or some high-profile businessperson, but he had the kind of presence that commanded attention. He was a man in his early 40s, dressed in a simple suit, with an air of quiet confidence about him. But there was something else about him that made her heart race, something more than just familiarity. As he made his way down the aisle, the flight attendant's face went pale. She quickly averted her gaze, her posture stiffening. The woman couldn't help but notice the subtle shift in her demeanor. It was as though this man's arrival had unsettled the flight attendant in a way she hadn't expected. Is there a problem? The man asked, his voice calm but with an underlying force that made it clear he wasn't asking just out of curiosity. There was an authority in his tone, one that immediately caused the flight attendant to stumble over her words. No, sir, she stammered. There's no issue, just a small misunderstanding. Everything's under control. The woman, standing just a few feet away, felt a flicker of doubt rise in her chest. She had no idea who this man was, but there was something in the way the flight attendant was reacting, something that didn't add up. The man's eyes briefly scanned the woman standing in front of him, then he turned to the flight attendant. It doesn't look like everything is under control to me. The flight attendant tried to maintain her composure, but it was clear that she was rattled. She glanced nervously at the woman, then back at the man. I was just helping this passenger. There was a seating issue, and I was trying to resolve it. The woman's heart pounded as she listened to the flight attendant's weak explanation. The seating issue? That was a lie, wasn't it? The flight attendant had been far more aggressive than that. Something wasn't right. The man didn't buy it either. He stepped closer, his gaze intensifying as he addressed the flight attendant. I think we both know that's not the full story. I've been watching you for a while, and your behavior towards this woman doesn't add up. The flight attendant shifted uncomfortably. I'm not sure what you mean, sir. I'm just trying to do my job. The man didn't flinch. You're not just doing your job. I've seen how you treat people like her before. It's not just a coincidence that you singled her out. The woman stood in stunned silence, trying to process what was unfolding. She didn't know who this man was, but his words hit too close to home. It was as if he knew the flight attendant had been acting out of something deeper than a simple mistake. Something that had been festering for a long time. Finally, the man turned to the woman, his gaze softening. Are you all right? He asked, his tone genuine. For the first time since the confrontation began, the woman felt a wave of relief wash over her. This stranger was speaking to her with respect, something she hadn't received from the flight attendant. She nodded slowly, her voice calm but firm. "I'm fine. Thank you for speaking up." The flight attendant, who had been growing more agitated with every word, couldn't take it anymore. She blurted out, "I don't know who you are, but I'm not going to stand here and be accused of something I didn't do." The man raised an eyebrow. "I think you've been doing quite a bit, and you know it. But that's not the point. The point is, you've been using your position to treat people differently. And I'm not going to let you get away with it." The woman's mind raced as she processed the exchange. Who was this man? Why was he so invested in this situation? And why had the flight attendant reacted so strongly to his presence? The man turned back to the flight attendant. "You've made this woman feel uncomfortable for no reason. I suggest you step aside, and let's figure out how we can make this right. Now." The flight attendant, red-faced and visibly shaken, opened her mouth to argue but thought better of it. With a sharp breath, she stepped back, reluctantly allowing the situation to diffuse. The supervisor, who had been watching from a distance, finally stepped forward. "What's going on here?" he asked, his tone tense. "This is getting out of hand," the man said, his voice unwavering. "You have a serious issue on your hands. I suggest you investigate what's really going on here before things get worse." The supervisor nodded, then turned to the flight attendant, who now appeared cornered and defeated. The woman, still trying to make sense of everything, glanced at the man who had stepped in. She couldn't help but wonder, who was he really? And why did he seem so invested in what was happening? What had prompted him to step in and challenge the flight attendant like that? As the plane continued its journey, the tension in the cabin was palpable. But the woman felt something shift inside her. This was no longer just about her. It was about standing up for what was right, and for all the people who had ever been made to feel small. The cabin was unusually quiet now. Passengers, once whispering and exchanging glances, seemed to have settled back into their seats. But the air was thick with uncertainty. The woman, who had remained standing throughout the exchange, now found herself seated again, her eyes fixed on the man who had come to her aid. He hadn't revealed much about himself, yet his presence had made a huge difference. The way he had confronted the flight attendant, calm but authoritative, had shaken her to the core. The woman still couldn't quite place what it was about him that had made such an impact. Was he a fellow passenger who just couldn't stand the injustice, or was there something more to him? As the flight attendants quietly resumed their duties, the woman couldn't help but glance over at the man. He was seated now, his posture relaxed, but there was an intensity in his gaze that didn't go unnoticed. His eyes met hers for a brief moment, and for a second, the noise of the plane seemed to disappear. She felt as if he could see through her, as if he understood her on a deeper level, even without words. Before she could gather her thoughts, the man stood up and began walking down the aisle. The woman watched him, unable to shake the strange connection she felt. The encounter had been brief, but it had changed something inside her. The way he had stood up to the flight attendant, it wasn't just about the confrontation. It was about something more, something powerful. He had defended her without question, without hesitation. And as he moved toward the back of the plane, the woman made a decision. She couldn't let this moment pass without understanding more. She had to speak to him. But how? As if on cue, the man turned and walked towards her. His steps were measured, confident, yet somehow purposeful, like he knew exactly where he was going. She stood up to meet him, heart racing, unsure of what to say. "I'm sorry about earlier," the man said, his voice quieter now, but still firm. "I couldn't just sit there and watch." He paused, then added, "It's not just about what happened to you. It's about what's happening everywhere." The woman blinked in surprise. His words seemed so profound, but it wasn't just the message, it was the conviction with which he spoke. He wasn't just another person voicing their opinion. There was something more. "I don't know what to say," she replied softly, still taken aback by his sudden approach. "I never expected this. I've had issues like this before, but I didn't think it would happen here, of all places." The man nodded thoughtfully. "That's the problem, isn't it? People think it's just a one-off. That it's rare. But it's not. It's everywhere. And we're all part of the solution, or the problem." The woman was silent for a moment, taking in his words. There was something raw in his voice, something genuine. She hadn't expected a stranger to speak to her this way. But it wasn't just the words he was saying, it was the feeling behind them. He wasn't just sympathizing with her, he was challenging her, too. Challenging her to look beyond the immediate situation and think bigger. "I'm sorry you had to deal with that," the man continued, his eyes meeting hers with a seriousness that made her heart skip a beat. "But don't let this one moment define how you see the world. It's about how you react, how you move forward from this." She swallowed hard, her throat suddenly tight. The emotional weight of his words hit her harder than she had expected. Was he right? Was it all about how she reacted? Her life, her choices, the way she saw herself, it had always been shaped by how others saw her. By how she was treated. But in this moment, it felt like she had the power to change that narrative. "What do you mean?" she asked quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. He smiled slightly, a knowing look in his eyes. "I can see it in your eyes. You've been through this before. But that's the thing, you can either let it break you, or you can use it to strengthen you. Don't let people define you. Don't let them take away your sense of who you are." The woman felt a lump in her throat as his words resonated deep within her. She had spent so much of her life battling these injustices, these moments where she had been made to feel less than. And now, here was a stranger, someone who didn't owe her anything, offering her something more valuable than any apology, understanding. For the first time, she didn't feel like the victim. She felt like she had the power to take control of the situation, to turn it into something that could change her life for the better. "I don't know if I can," she admitted, the vulnerability in her voice surprising even herself. "But I want to try." The man gave her a reassuring nod, as if he understood exactly what she meant. "Then that's all you need. The rest will follow." And with that, he turned and walked away, leaving the woman standing there, her thoughts spinning. She felt something shift inside her, a deep realization settling in. This wasn't just about the flight, or the flight attendant, or even the man who had come to her aid. It was about her, her ability to rise above, to be the one who defined her worth, no matter what others thought or said. She sat back down in her seat, her heart still pounding. The rest of the flight would pass in a blur, but she knew one thing for sure, everything had changed. She wasn't going to let herself be treated like an outsider anymore. She was going to use this moment as a stepping stone, not just for herself but for everyone who had ever felt the sting of discrimination. It was time to stand tall, to take control of her own narrative. The plane began its descent toward the destination, but the woman's mind was elsewhere. It felt as though time had slowed down for her, each passing second stretching out with new possibilities. The words the man had spoken echoed in her thoughts, stirring something deep inside her. She had spent so many years carrying the weight of others' words and actions, but now she felt like she could finally let it go. She could move forward without the burden of past wrongs. But the question that lingered in her mind was how. How could she move on from everything she had faced? How could she take the high road, not just for herself, but for others, too? The idea of forgiveness seemed daunting, even impossible. How could she forgive those who had wronged her, who had treated her with such disrespect, just because of the color of her skin? Yet, the more she thought about it, the more she realized that forgiveness wasn't about excusing the actions of others. It was about freeing herself from the anger and pain that had held her captive for so long. It was about taking control of her own emotions and reactions, not letting the actions of others define her. The plane finally touched down, and the woman stood up, grabbing her bag. She noticed the man who had helped her earlier, now standing in the aisle as well, preparing to leave. Their eyes met once more, but this time, there was something different in her gaze. She didn't feel like a victim anymore. She didn't feel small. She felt empowered. As the passengers began to disembark, the woman walked toward the man. She didn't know why she was approaching him, but it felt right. She stopped in front of him, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. "Thank you," she said quietly, her voice steady. "For standing up for me." The man looked at her, his expression soft but knowing. "You're welcome," he replied. "But it wasn't just for you. It's for everyone who has ever felt small, pushed down, or ignored. It's about us all." The woman nodded, her heart swelling with gratitude. "I don't know how to thank you for that," she said, her voice cracking slightly. "But I'll try. I'll try to live my life differently now. I won't let anyone define me. Not anymore." The man smiled, his eyes reflecting a warmth that made the woman feel seen, understood, and, for the first time in a long while, valued. "You don't have to thank me," he said gently. "Just remember that you have the power to change your own story. And the more you stand up for yourself, the more others will see that strength in you." As the woman walked toward the exit, a sense of calm washed over her. She knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be moments when the world would try to pull her back, when people would try to break her spirit. But now, she understood that those moments didn't have to define her. What mattered was how she responded. What mattered was how she chose to rise above the noise, to choose forgiveness over bitterness, and strength over fear. As she stepped into the terminal, she looked around at the sea of strangers, each with their own story, their own struggles. For a moment, she felt a deep connection to them all, as if they were all part of something bigger. A shared humanity that transcended race, gender, or background. And with that realization came a new sense of purpose. She had the power to change not only her own life but the lives of those around her. She wasn't just a passive participant in her own story. She was the author, the one who could shape her future and inspire others to do the same. As the woman walked through the bustling terminal, the weight of the day's events began to settle in. She had expected to feel a sense of relief, of closure, but instead, a new kind of curiosity gnawed at her. Her encounter with the flight attendant, the intervention of the mysterious man, and the words he had shared with her, they had all unlocked something deep inside her. She couldn't stop thinking about it, couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this story than what had been revealed on the plane. Her thoughts were interrupted by a voice behind her, calling her name. "Excuse me, miss." She turned to find the flight attendant, the one who had confronted her earlier, standing a few feet away. Her expression was no longer one of anger or hostility. In fact, it looked like regret. The woman felt a flutter of surprise. She had not expected to see the flight attendant again, especially not under these circumstances. The flight attendant hesitated for a moment before speaking, her voice softer than it had been during their confrontation. "I owe you an apology," she said, her words hesitant but sincere. "I don't know what came over me back there. That wasn't who I am. It wasn't right." The woman stood still for a moment, surprised by the apology. She hadn't expected it, hadn't thought it would come from someone who had treated her with such disrespect just hours before. But in that moment, something shifted inside her. She could feel the power of forgiveness rising within her, the very thing that the man had spoken of. "I appreciate that," the woman replied, her voice calm and steady. "But I think we both know that words aren't enough. I'm not angry with you anymore, but I do think there's more to this than just a misunderstanding." The flight attendant's face tightened with something like guilt. "I know," she admitted quietly. "There's more. I'm sorry for what I did, but it's not just about what happened today. I've been carrying things inside me for a long time, things I never knew how to deal with. The woman's curiosity grew. This wasn't just an apology for the incident, it was something deeper, something that the flight attendant had never been able to confront until now. "I've worked this job for years," the flight attendant continued, her voice trembling slightly. "But every day, I've felt like I'm part of something that I don't even understand anymore. I've seen things I can't unsee, things that have made me hate myself. Hate who I've become." The woman felt a pang of sympathy. She didn't know the flight attendant's full story, but in that moment, she understood that people don't just act out of nowhere. There were always deeper reasons, hidden pain, unresolved issues that shaped their behavior. "I've been dealing with a lot of anger that I didn't know how to channel. And I took it out on you," the flight attendant confessed, her voice breaking slightly. "I'm sorry. I've been part of a system that I can't change, and it's made me bitter. I'm sorry that I let it affect you." The woman listened, absorbing the flight attendant's words. She could feel the raw emotion behind them, the pain that had been buried for so long. It wasn't an excuse for her actions, but it was a reason. And in that moment, the woman realized something important. Forgiveness wasn't just about letting go of anger. It was about understanding the complexity of people, the messiness of life. It was about recognizing that everyone had their own battles, even if they didn't always show it. "I can't change what happened," the woman said softly, "but I can choose how I respond. And right now, I choose to forgive you." The flight attendant looked up, her eyes wide with shock. She hadn't expected those words. She hadn't expected this kind of grace. But it was in that moment that the flight attendant began to understand something that had eluded her for so long. True strength didn't come from power or authority. It came from vulnerability, from the ability to admit mistakes, to ask for forgiveness, and to offer it in return. Thank you," the flight attendant whispered. "You don't know what that means." The woman nodded, offering a small smile. "It means everything." The flight attendant stepped back, still processing the exchange. Before she turned to walk away, she paused and said one last thing: "I'll make sure no one else ever feels like you did today. I promise." As the woman watched the flight attendant disappear into the crowd, a sense of calm settled over her. She had just witnessed something remarkable, a moment of genuine change. It wasn't easy, and it didn't come without struggle, but it was real. The flight attendant had shown vulnerability and taken responsibility, and that was something the woman would never forget. She stepped out into the busy terminal, feeling lighter than she had in years. She hadn't just learned a lesson about forgiveness that day, she had learned something deeper about humanity. People were not defined by their mistakes or their past. It was how they chose to move forward, how they chose to change, that mattered. And as she walked out of the airport, she felt ready to face the world with a new perspective, a perspective that wasn't just about surviving, but about thriving, about rising above the noise and finding peace in the face of adversity. The woman stepped outside the airport, the crisp air hitting her face like a breath of fresh life. She had been through so much today, yet now, with the weight of it all lifting from her shoulders, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time: hope. It wasn't a loud, overpowering feeling, but a quiet certainty that she was on the right path, one step closer to finding peace and understanding. The world outside the terminal was as busy as ever, people rushing from one gate to the next, their faces absorbed in their own lives. But the woman saw them differently now. Each person, she realized, carried their own story, stories of pain, triumph, regret, and hope. She was no longer a passive observer of life. She had learned to engage with it, to take control of her own narrative, regardless of the challenges she might face. As she walked to her car, her mind began to reflect on the events of the past few hours. What had begun as an unpleasant encounter on a plane had somehow become the catalyst for a deeper transformation. It wasn't just the confrontation with the flight attendant or the support of the man who had stood up for her, it was the realization that she could choose how to respond to the world. She didn't have to let the biases, prejudices, or mistakes of others define her. She could be the one to shape her future. The road ahead would not be without its challenges, of course. She knew that. There would be more moments when she would be tested, when people would try to break her down or push her to the margins. But for the first time in a long while, she felt ready for those moments. She had learned the power of forgiveness, the strength of empathy, and the importance of standing up for herself and others. And above all, she had learned that true strength didn't lie in keeping silent, it lay in speaking out, in taking action, and in lifting others up along the way. As she drove home, her thoughts turned to the flight attendant. She had never expected the encounter to end the way it had. The flight attendant's apology had been sincere, and the woman couldn't help but admire her willingness to open up, to share the burden she had been carrying for so long. In some ways, it reminded her that people were not their mistakes, they were the sum of their actions, their choices, and their willingness to grow. The road was long, and the journey felt even longer as her mind continued to process everything that had happened. But as the miles stretched on, something inside her clicked into place. She was no longer carrying the heavy weight of anger or bitterness. She wasn't letting the mistakes of others define her anymore. She was walking through life with a newfound sense of freedom, a sense that she had the power to choose her own path. When she finally arrived home, she stood outside her front door for a moment, taking in the quiet stillness of the evening. It felt like the calm after a storm, like everything had finally settled into place. She was tired, but it was a good kind of tired, the kind that comes from having confronted something difficult and emerging stronger for it. Inside, the house was warm and welcoming, a place she had always felt safe. But tonight, it felt even more like a sanctuary, a place where she could embrace who she had become, not who others had tried to make her. As she settled into her living room, the weight of the day finally lifted. It had been a day of reckoning, but also of revelation. She had faced the discomfort of confrontation, the vulnerability of self-reflection, and the unexpected kindness of strangers. And through it all, she had learned that the greatest power she held was not in her ability to fight back, but in her ability to forgive, to rise above the negativity, and to move forward with grace. The woman's eyes settled on the quiet darkness outside her window, and she smiled softly to herself. It had been a long journey to this point, but she was finally at peace with who she was. And that, she realized, was the most important thing of all. The night passed quietly, and when the woman woke the next morning, a sense of clarity lingered. It wasn't just a sense of relief, it was a deep understanding that had settled into her bones. The events of the previous day, though unexpected and overwhelming, had unfolded in a way that would change her forever. She had learned that the key to moving forward in life wasn't about controlling everything around her, but about controlling how she responded to it. Her mind drifted back to the words the man had spoken on the plane. You have the power to change your own story. It wasn't just a motivational speech. It was the truth. She realized that all her life, she had let others dictate her narrative. But now, she was the one holding the pen. She had the ability to choose how to react, how to grow, and how to move through the world with intention. There were many times throughout her life when she had felt small, times when people's words, actions, and biases made her feel less than. But what she had learned, what had become clear in the aftermath of everything, was that those moments didn't have to define her. Her power wasn't in avoiding the discomfort, but in embracing it and using it as fuel to rise higher. Forgiveness had been key. Not just for the flight attendant or the passengers who had silently watched, but for herself as well. The bitterness she had carried around for so long wasn't doing her any good. It wasn't serving her or the people she loved. It was only weighing her down. Forgiveness didn't mean forgetting, it meant releasing herself from the chains of resentment, allowing herself the freedom to move forward. The woman knew that her journey was far from over. There would still be moments when she would face challenges, when people would try to tear her down, when life would test her. But now, she understood that her response was what mattered most. It wasn't about how many times she was knocked down, it was about how many times she got back up. And every time she did, she would be stronger, wiser, and more resilient. As she sat down at her kitchen table with a cup of coffee, she thought about the flight attendant. She had apologized, yes, but more than that, she had shown a willingness to change. And that, the woman realized, was the most important part of the story. People weren't defined by their mistakes. They were defined by their ability to learn from them, to admit when they were wrong, and to work toward becoming better. The woman had seen that in the flight attendant, and she realized that this was a lesson she could carry with her in all her interactions. No one was beyond redemption. She thought about the man who had spoken to her with such understanding. He had seen something in her, something that had helped her see her own worth. She would never forget how his words had pushed her to confront her own fears, to face the painful truths she had been avoiding. Sometimes, all it takes is for someone to believe in you when you don't believe in yourself. And in that moment, she had been ready to believe. As the sun began to rise outside her window, casting a warm glow on everything it touched, the woman felt a sense of peace settle within her. She had faced the unknown, had stepped into a moment of discomfort and challenge, and had come out the other side stronger for it. This wasn't just about the flight or the conflict, it was about a journey toward self-empowerment, a journey that would continue every single day. She smiled to herself. Life wasn't always easy, but it was always worth the fight. And with each new day, she would continue to fight for what she believed in, for the truth she had discovered within herself, and for the peace she had finally found. The greatest lesson she had learned was this. It's not what happens to you that defines who you are. It's how you choose to respond. And no matter the obstacles, no matter the setbacks, you have the power to turn any situation into an opportunity for growth, strength, and change. The power is yours.